let's take a look at which direction these markets are really heading. Will it be a bull? Will it be a bear market? Or are these markets just going to go sideways? Now, if we look at the S&P over the last 30 years, my question would be, how many down years has the S&P with dividends had? First of all, looking at the last 10 years from 2005 to 2014, what would you say to that? How about the previous 10-year period from 95 to 2004? And last, the 10-year period prior, 1985 to 1994. Now, this is going to surprise you. In the last 10 years, only one. The previous 10-year period, 3. And between 85 and 94, again, only one down year. Tremendous volatility every week, day, hour. But when you look at the calendar years, the number of down years that the S&P with dividends has had are very few. Complete disconnect between emotionally what everyone believes and the truth of the matter. So let's take a look at this chart. Again, in 2014, the S&P went up 13.69% with dividends. So if we look at this 10-year period, what we find is only one down year, 2008, the Great Recession, where the market dropped 37%. This means 90% of those years, the markets were up. Previous 10-year period, we had 3 down years. The dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, followed by the tragic event of 9/11 in 2001, and the aftermath. This is the only 3-year consecutive period since the Great Depression that the market went down in 3 consecutive years, as I said. This downdraft was almost 40%. So the frequency of this event, this 3-year event, which happens very rarely, created about as much damage as this 1-year catastrophic event in 2008. So looking at this 10-year period, the market was up 70% of the time. How about the 10-year period, 85 through 94? Only one down year when Saddam invades Kuwait. And although it was true that the Dow dropped 18% in the summer of 90, the S&P with dividends finished down only 3% on the year. 90% of that 10-year period, the market was up. So let's look at the average annual rate of return of the S&P with dividends over the last 10, 20, and 30-year period. What do we see? 9.48 over the last 10, 11.74 for the 20-year period ending December 31 of 14, and 12.84 going back 30 years. Now, of course, past performance is no guarantee of what the future holds, but it's important to keep this information in mind. Now, what would be interesting is, let's suppose we were able to invest in the S&P, and one way we were able to invest, let's just suppose, was the S&P couldn't go down in value when the market did. So, for example, let's just suppose that we were able to invest in something that guaranteed that when the market went down, you had a floor of 0%. So when the market dropped 37% in 08, you would actually lose nothing. But in exchange, when the market would go up, let's say in 09, like it did 26.46%, let's suppose you were capped at 12. So a growth floor of 0% and a growth ceiling of 12%. If that were true, if we looked at the last 10, 20, and 30-year period of time, you're going to see average annual rates of return between 7.75 and almost 8%. But no sleepless nights like we had here in this 3-year period or in 2008. A smoothing out of average annual rates of return. Last, what if we invested in the S&P where we took the growth of the S&P, multiplied it by 150% with a ceiling of 10. So if the S&P went up 5, you'd get 7.5. If the S&P went up 4, you'd get 6. But a ceiling of 10 and again a floor of 0. And what you see is the average 10, 20, and 30-year period hovers right around 7%. Now, how often, going all the way back to the 1930s, did the S&P increase in value? 40% during the Great Depression decade. World War II, the market couldn't possibly go up during that decade. The 50s, 80% of the time. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 90% of the time. Worst decade of investing since the Great Depression, January 1, 2000 to 12/31/09, the market went up 60% of the time.